Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Let me make a few opening comments as the group comes in. Steve, this is not counting on my 6 sentences because those are for the introduction. Come on in, have a seat. This is going to be a great program, and I'm eager to get it started. We have a few people outside. While the rest of you trickle in, I'll start by saying good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to see you all here. My name is Al Pisano, and I'm the Dean of Engineering here at UC San Diego. And I'll just offer one anecdote. Engineering at UC San Diego is the largest school of engineering in the state of California. You are looking at a machine that has 8,711 students right now. That is 7,000 undergraduates and over 1,700 graduate students. So this is the biggest, most ginormous, best-kept secret in SoCal. And it's our job to make sure it is no longer a secret. Let's get now to my talking points, and I promised Steve that I would give exactly 6 sentences. And you know, who else but a guy who does lean startups would say, Al, I want a lean introduction. All right, so here it comes. Welcome to the Entrepreneurism and Leadership Program's first distinguished lecture. 2, I am pleased to welcome Steve Blanc as our speaker. 3, he is an 8-time serial entrepreneur turned educator and author who has authored the Startup Owner's Manual and, of course, the seminal work, The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. 4, Steve's books and blog have redefined how to build successful startups, and his Lean Launchpad class at Stanford, Berkeley, and Columbia, soon to be UC San Diego, has redefined how entrepreneurship is taught. 5, our fireside chat with Steve will be moderated by Dr. Jay Cunin, the Executive Director of the Moxie Center for Student Entrepreneurship. And finally, over the last 2.5 years, Jay has built the Moxie Center's education and incubator programs for UC San Diego students using Lean Launchpad as a key foundation. Without any other sentences,
that's perfect.
I give you Steve Blanc.
All right, an A
Jay
in the
Cunin.
class, don't you think?
So, thank you, Al. So welcome again, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
Steve and I actually go way back. We determined that it was his 3rd startup and my 2nd startup where I was his customer. So far back that neither of us can remember any details.
Or won't admit to them.
So, I'm going to ask Steve a few questions, and he will
See if I can answer them.
Chat with us, and then I want to get reasonably quickly to questions from the audience.
Great. And if you want to tweet it, it's at SG Blank and any other handle you want to put on it.
Okay. We have at Moxie Center as well.
At Moxie Center. Great.
So Steve, you've been an 8-time entrepreneur in the recent or maybe not so recent past. So how did startups get built when you were doing that?
You know, when I was an entrepreneur, startups were simply thought of as smaller versions of large companies. And this is a big idea. That is, we were told by the people who financed us, the angel investors and the venture capitalists, that essentially everything a large company did, we needed to do. Large companies wrote business plans, 40-page documents with 5 pages of spreadsheets in the back, and we needed to do that. And never once realizing that the only people to require a 5-year plan for a series of unknowns was the Soviet Union and venture capitalists. But in any case, we had to do that, and the other thing we didn't understand at the time is no VC actually read the plan, but that was the only thing they knew how to get you to kind of organize your thoughts. The second is they kind of assumed that much like a large company, the thing that mattered was the org chart, so we were going to hire sales, marketing, biz dev, engineering, and scale it as per the plan. That is, assuming that everything we put down that plan was a fact. And all we assumed was that all we needed to do was get the money and team together to execute those facts, and therefore the end result would simply be bags of money coming in the door. You're supposed to laugh here because that's not how the real world worked, but venture capitalists didn't care because enough of them did somehow work that they made enough money to keep insisting on this process for decades. And we'd go through a traditional waterfall process, that is an engineering process that was serial, that said, you know, you write a spec and then you do development and then you go through alpha test, beta test, and first customer ship. And then you would ship the product and everything would just occur as per that plan you wrote when you were under the influence of some either drug or something or alcohol in your dorm room and assume that everything would work like that. And if it didn't, by the way, work like that, last point, is that you blamed an individual. If sales wasn't working, then you waited for a couple months and then you fired their VP of sales. And 9 months later, if that still wasn't working, a new VP of sales blamed it on the VP of marketing. And if that didn't work, you got fired because you were the founder, and then you became, if you stayed around, you became the, you know, chairman of the board or something, but they brought in a new CEO. Never once did anybody ever question that perhaps the plan was wrong. That his failure was always attributed to the inability to execute that brilliant plan that was set in stone.
So what do we think now that's different? How do we do it now?
So the contribution I made, and then others, Eric Ries, Alexander Osterwalder, a whole stack of people now, came from a set of very big ideas that are stupidly simple. Just by itself, that's an interesting observation. One is that startups are not smaller versions of large companies. Big idea. Startups do something very different. Large companies execute what we call known business models, which is a fancy word for saying a large company is large because they know who their customers are, they know who their competitors are, they know how to distribute the product, they know how to price it, they figured out all this stuff. And so in a large company, it's an execution problem. And I use the word execution from just meaning do the same thing over and over again at scale with a known process. But a startup, what we never understood is a startup isn't in execution mode at all in the first year or two. The big idea was while large companies execute known business models, startups, you guys, are searching for business models. And no one had ever articulated this distinction between search and execution. And why that was really important is for the last 100 or so years, business schools have churned out managers who knew how to execute. That's what we trained. We taught cadres and cohorts of MBAs to learn about strategy and tactics and supply chain and operations theory.
Masters of Business
Masters
Administration.
of Business Administration. Administration, execution. Not how to search for business models. And that wasn't like no business school had ever not thought about search and innovation, but no one had ever created this distinction. And the minute you actually realize that that's actually what startups do in the first year or two, they think they're executing, but they almost always get it wrong, is that we didn't even have a theory, let alone any tools, on how to actually help startups search for business models. And that was the beginning of my contribution.
So what is a business model that a startup is searching for?
So for the last 20 years, if you search the literature, you know, there were books and piles of papers, and if you want to learn what a business model was, you know, the minimum required was probably 175 pages of someone's, you know, turgid text, which, you know, I tend to write those as well. But about 5 years ago, or now maybe 6 years ago, someone named Alexander Osterwalder came up with a book called Business Model Generation. Any of you read that at all? Anybody read it? It should be, for any of you who are entrepreneurs, should be on all your shelves. And why it should be on your shelves is the good news is there's not many words in the book. I love it because it's all pictures. And in fact, Osterwalder got this concept of a business model down to a single diagram. It's a big idea. It's called the Business Model Canvas. You could Google it, you could download it, etc. And he said, which is an amazing, amazing insight. Listen, instead of drawing org charts, that is, you know, who's the boss and where you fit, we ought to be drawing business models. And now to answer a question, what a business model is, it simply says, what are all the components, all the pieces that you as the founder and your investors need to worry about to build a successful business? And so here they are. They're just 9. One is, what's your value proposition? Now already he's using fancy words, but if every time you hear the word value proposition, you think, what's the product or service you're building? Okay, I could write that down. All right. And then number 2 is, who are you building it for? What's the customer segments? Or who are the stakeholders if you're in life sciences? Okay, I could figure out, yeah, I think these will be my customers. All right, how are you going to get the product from you to your customers? Not the physical truck, but what's the channel of distribution? Is it direct sales? Is it an app store? Is it some other way? Is it a retail store? Number 4 is, how are you going to get people into that sales channel? How are you going to create demand? How are you going to acquire and activate customers? How are you going to get to keep them and grow them? That's called customer relationships. Number 5 is like, how are you going to make money? Both the strategy, that is it going to be a subscription or a freemium product or just a regular, here's the price, and what's the pricing tactics? That is it $9.99 or $9,000? And then the other 4 pieces are, what activities does your company need to be expert at to pull off that value proposition and the channel and the rest? Do you need manufacturing? Do you need clinical data for drugs or devices? Do you need to have freedom to operate, that is, own IP? And therefore, the next piece is, what resources do you need? Do you need employees? Do you need a physical plant? Do you need financing, capital? Is this going to be something, financed by seed funding, or are you eventually going to need $200 million to pull off SpaceX? And then, do you need partners to do this, or can you do it all yourselves? And then finally, what are the costs? I just described those 9 boxes. Before Osterwald, there truly was 175-page text. I just described what a business model is. That's the core of what startups are actually searching for on day 1. And can I tell them the big idea?
Oh, go.
The big idea is, if you're a founder, you could go through this exercise in a half hour. Oh, here's who my customers are going to be. Here's my product. Here's my cost. Here's my whatever. And I guarantee you now, we know something that you don't. And what we now know is you're wrong. Whatever you write down, maybe you're going to get the value proposition right, because you might be a technologist, and if you're coming out of engineering, gee, I know all about my technology. Yeah, here's who's going to buy it, or here's why people should be interested. The big insight we have, and this is my contribution, is all you have on day 1, besides maybe some technical facts, is all you have is a series of untested hypotheses about the commercialization side of your business. And by the way, outside of the university, we use a special word for hypotheses. Anybody know what it is? Guessing. You're just guessing. And if you really think about it, that's pretty embarrassing if you're an engineer. So we use a much fancier word that says hypothesis. So the second part of this lean startup, the first part is, we'll use a business model canvas to kind of lay up or set up our hypotheses. The second part is, just like we do in the lab, we're going to set up experiments to get out of the building and test our hypotheses. Unlike experiments we do in the lab, the places that we need to test them are actually out in front of customers. And so the second part of what's called a lean startup is called customer development. We're actually going to formally test hypotheses with experiments and see what the results are, and depending on the results, we're either going to validate or invalidate the hypotheses and modify them and do some more tests until we actually can understand whether we have a valid model for commercialization. And the third piece of this is building something called minimum viable products, which is another fancy name for, we're going to build prototypes that are iterative and incremental. Instead of building finished product or alpha tests or beta tests, we're going to actually maximize how much we learn every time we get out of the building in front of customers. And a first minimum viable product could simply be a PowerPoint slide, or it could be a wireframe, or it could be a clay model of a heart pump or a catheter or something else. Because what you're trying to do is elicit feedback at every stage of this process. What was your question?
What was your answer?
I don't remember either. Maybe we could ask the room.
So how do you, so we have a company that's started by 3 engineers, and why don't we just send out some surveys and ask our friends and and hire a marketing company to go out and find out what the market looks like?
You know, that's a great question. Because, gee, if you're a passionate engineer, you know, the thing you most want to do, or at least for most of you, is, you know, like, stop asking me to do this stuff. I need to add more features, or I need to finish the product, or, you know, like I'm wasting my time. Someone else could go do that. It turns out that's probably true if your goal is to build a product. That's a going out of business strategy if your goal is to build a company. And I want you to ponder that for a second. The hardest thing I have found scientists and engineers have to grasp, and I don't mean this as an insult, but your technology, as brilliant as it is, and I'll make the exception for anti-gravity, is only a very small sliver of what makes up a viable company. And while you've been immersed in building that science and you think it's 100% of what makes the company, it's actually, again, let me say it again, a very small part of what will make a successful company. And if you as the founder don't understand that, then the odds of success are diminished. And I'll guarantee you the odds of you actually running that company over time from professional investors are certainly diminished. And so what we're trying to do is have the people who built the technology get out of the building and understand the other key components that actually turn a technology or an insight about technology into a business. And having proxies actually eliminates the real value of having a scientist or engineer do that. And let me give you an example. You know, some of our students are principal investigators in universities, and you know, they've been working on some therapeutics for years. You get them in front of some R&D group at Roche, and it's a little sobering when they hear, oh, we've read your paper. You know, we thought we'd take the meeting, but FYI, we have 6 of what you're working on in our own pipeline. Oops. Well, normally if that was a proxy, the meeting was over, except that almost half the time you hear them say, too bad you're not working on Y. And they go, really? That's important? Yeah, oh, you know, we found the real target for that. Too bad you're not working on that. And they go, well, I've had that in the lab for 4 years. And the conversation now goes into a place where no proxy could have gone. The second part about getting out of the building is it's only the founder who actually could make strategic changes in the direction of the company. We call these strategic changes pivots. A pivot is defined as a substantive change to one or more of those pieces of the business model. That is, I'm going to change my customer, or I'm going to change my sales channel, or I'm going to change pricing. You can't have some proxy come back and say, it isn't selling this way, here's what we need to do. If you're the founder, you're going to say the first time some proxy says that, whether it's a head of sales or biz dev, you're just not explaining it correctly. And the second time they come back and say, no, no, this is unsaleable, if you're the founding CEO sitting in your office, you're going to say you're fired. The experiment to run, and just think about it, is I won't let you hire a VP of sales until you found a business model. Now you need to hear that feedback directly. Let me tell you, the first time someone tells you your baby's ugly, you're going to check to see if you're holding it right side up. Because you're going to go, well, wait a minute, I think it's the prettiest baby I've ever seen. And after about 5 or 6 more times, smoke's going to come out of your ears because cognitive dissonance is setting in. Meaning you think it's a great solution and you love the product and no one else does.
Well, I know we've had a number of cases where students have gone out and talked to people and come back and found out that nobody cares except them. You've run a lot more students through your courses at several universities. You have some interesting lessons that they've learned from
Sure.
following or not following the model?
You're taking me somewhere. Help me where you want to go. And then I'll tell you the answer to the question you want to ask.
Why don't you answer whichever question you prefer?
I could make it up all night. You know, it's really easy to kind of fall in love with your idea. In fact, that's the definition of a founder. I mean, you're not only a visionary, you could see things that others can't, but you're passionate about making that real. And so that's both the driver of entrepreneurial progress, and that's also the Shakespearean tragedy of entrepreneurship, is you get so blinded that you believe that you understand the customer's problem so deeply, all you need to do is stay in your lab and office and implement it. That's the trap. The real test is, for me, great, humor me. Find me 5 other people who share your view of the problem. Get out of the building and great, let's agree. I don't want to slow you down. Just find 5 other people, and not who just tell you it's great, who would actually tell you they'd pay for it now because it's that important. Oops. So the way we do the customer development process is step 1 is let's go validate that your view of the problem, forget the product, that your view of the problem is shared by others at the same way you believe it. And then if you find those people, take the conversation to the next step, is let's make sure that your view on the solution, not the details, not the specs, not the UI, but just the class of solution is shared by someone else. And if no one is interested, we might save you a ton of money and time. Not that you're going to cancel the project, but you might want to understand, why don't people share your vision? Gee, and half the time, things I thought were incredibly important actually were on people's list, except it was problem number 49 rather than problem 3. People typically don't solve problem 49 or pay for it. They solve what was top of mind for them, and I didn't quite understand the context or the importance or where it fit. And so getting out of the classroom or the building or the office is the first step to do that. Did I answer the question you were trying to get me to answer?
Sure.
Okay.
But I'm an engineer, and I want to be, I want to spend my time building products. And
Yeah. So how many of you want to be a founder of a company? Okay. And how many of you, keep your hands up, how many of you are engineers? Okay. You have a problem. And so let me explain, and can I be crude for 30 seconds? If you don't learn these skills, you're going to be bullshitted your whole life by VPs of sales and marketing. You will. And ultimately, someone else is going to run your company for you. And if that's okay with you, ignore everything we're talking about here. And we're not trying to train you to be sales and marketing people. Let me just emphasize that. We don't want to change your career. But if you want to build a company that's different, well, let me just make that absolutely clear. If you're a scientist and an engineer and you want to build a company versus just do more science and engineering, you need to understand the components of building a company firsthand, not third hand, firsthand. Eventually, you could hire people to actually execute those processes for you. Of course, you're going to hire a VP of sales and a VP of marketing, VP of biz dev. But if you don't understand or even have the judgment of what is a sales channel and what's the right one for us, and you're just going to be outsourcing stuff that actually is critical to the success of the company. So imagine the difference between a scientist or principal investigator who just has gone through kind of the I-Corps process, that is the National Science Foundation class or one of your classes, and actually has figured out how to talk to J&J or Medtronics and whatever, and actually got the first deals with them personally. And now tries to hire a VP of sales who actually comes in and says, oh, I know everybody at J&J and Medtronics, and you go, well, that's funny. I just did the first $5 million of revenue from them myself. Tell me what else you're going to do for me. Man, that's a much different interview than someone coming in and waving their Rolodex around and telling you how smart they are. That's a very different skill set that we could train people in literally 3 months. I mean, it doesn't take 3 years, doesn't take a career change, but takes you getting immersed in hypothesis testing in areas that might potentially make you uncomfortable at first.
so if we can teach people to do this, teach engineers and scientists, does that mean that you can teach someone how to be an entrepreneur?
Well, this is a great question. And it's one I struggled with for a long time until I made the observation, a couple of observations. One is that entrepreneurship is not a job. It's a calling. It's a big idea. Accounting is a job. Finance is a job. Marketing is a job. But entrepreneurship, you're called if you want to be a founder. I'm not talking about an early employee or a later employee, but if you want to found a company and the only reason you're doing it here is because your friends are doing it, you're better off working somewhere else. Because it's the world's shittiest job. Truly. It's the world's shittiest job that you can make $100 million at. That's the good news. And again, raise your hand, who wants to be founders? Okay? There's someone in this room, at least one, that's going to be worth $100 million. The bad news is the rest of you would have been better off working at Walmart. And so you don't do it because you want to make the money. It's a Zen-like thing. The more you chase the dollars, the further away they will be. You do it because entrepreneurs, founders, are closer to artists than any other profession. Artists, at their core, want to bring something inside of them and share it with the rest of the world, whether they're painters or musicians or sculptors. World-class founders, those of you who want to do this, that has to be what drives you, or else you will not get past the miserable times that exist. Being a founding CEO, your co-founder will quit, you'll run out of money, you'll have to lay off people, your biggest customer changes their mind. What gets you through those miserable times is that your eye is on the prize, not the obstacles. And your job is just to remove the obstacles to get to where you're going. And 500 years ago, we finally figured out how to teach art in the Renaissance. We teach, basic theory. We teach color, we teach perspective, we teach whatever, and then we realized it's a ton of apprenticeship and hands-on. It's experiential. We figured out the same with brain surgery. No one would want a surgeon who didn't know theory, but you certainly wouldn't want one who had practiced on someone else before they got to you. The same is true for entrepreneurship, much like we're teaching it here, is while we're going to teach you theory, we're really going to teach you practice. And that involves an enormous hands-on. But I'll just go back to answer your question. If you're not called for this, don't do it because it's cool, or wait till someone else starts a company and raises the money, and then you could be an early employee or a later employee. But if you're going to be a founder, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons.
So you've taught about how many teams over the last few years?
Hundreds, if not a couple thousand through
Okay.
I-Corps.
So give us a few examples of who succeeded and why.
Yeah, I think
who's
that,
failed and why.
Yeah. One of my favorite stories is a company that started in an engineering class at Stanford. These were machine vision robotics folks who decided that the best thing they could do with their parents' money at Stanford was to build a robotic lawnmower. All of you are supposed to laugh, because maybe some of you are working on one. Trust me, it's not a good idea. And we knew it wasn't a good idea, but we interviewed these teams not only for idea, but what we've learned over time for passion, commitment, interest, etc. And so they got out of the building, and within a couple weeks of the class, they also discovered, yes, they could build it, but the cost of what it would cost versus the cost of somebody pushing a lawnmower around, it wasn't a business. It was a great technical idea. And they were, like all teams, kind of depressed and whatever. And we kind of said, well, where else could this technology be used? Oh, we don't know anywhere. I said, well, think about what's within, California. Where else? We kind of knew, but we let them discover. In Silicon Valley, we're about 90 miles from the Salinas Valley, which is one of the hearts of California agriculture. And it turned out that organic crops were, a good number of them, still picked by hand. And all the hardware and machine vision stuff they understood how to build could differentiate between weeds and crops better than even human beings could. And in the middle of the class, they were very happy. We've discovered a new market for our device, and look at that. We could sell it to farmers who who were currently using illegal immigrants to hand-pick organic crops, or pick weeds. And they said, oh, we're on the path for getting an A. And I said, let me go up to the whiteboard and show you something that as students at Stanford you've never seen before. And I drew the letter B. And they said, what's that? And I said, I know, you guys have never seen it. This is going to be your grade. And first I had to process what letter that was, and relative, the curve at Stanford is A minus to A plus, for those who don't know, from the engineering school. And they said, why? We've discovered customers. I said, where's the robot? They said, Professor Blank, you couldn't build one of these things in a year. I said, you got a week. A week? We're going to quit the class. We're going to the dean. I said, I guess you're not good enough. Well, of course, tell that to any of you guys, right? So they came up with a carrot bot in a week, which it wasn't self-propelled, but it was a machine vision platform that could differentiate between weeds and carrots. And they drug it through the farm fields of Salinas, and lo and behold, they started talking to farmers. It turned out the World Ag Expo was in California at the same time the class was. And so they learned a lot about customers and needs and whatever. Make a long story short, and remember, because this is a class, not an incubator, I really don't emphasize building profitable companies. What I emphasize is maximize learning in the class. And if they happen to be companies out of this, so be it. The good news is, by the end of the class, they actually discovered they had a viable business. Today, they're known as Blue River Technology. Any of you could look them up. They now harvest something close to 4% of all the lettuce in the United States. And they were funded by Coastal Ventures and the NSF and a bunch of other, and actually have something that came out of the class. And so their major pivot was discovering that their customer segment was wrong. Also, they believed they were going to sell the platform. Gee, it's like a tractor. Turns out that farmers taught them how to price it. They were going to price per the density of weeds per acre. And there was no way they could have figured that out in the classroom.
Without talking to the
without
customers.
talking to customers. So that's one good example. There's another one.
What grade did they ultimately get?
A. But they didn't get an A+. But there's another good example of I had a team who was doing a drone to fly over agricultural fields, again in California. It was the beginning of the drought then, to be able to see per plant or per tree who had enough or insufficient water and fertilizer. They were going to put what's called a hyperspectral scanner inside the drone and figure out whether this was a business. And they pivoted and iterated pretty well in class, except after class I got a call. Hey, Professor Blank, we're raising $500,000. I know you couldn't talk to us in the class, but you're interested in my work. I said, what do you need $500,000 for? And they said, oh, let us remind you implicitly, you might be old and stupid, don't remember us. I go, no, I remember you guys. You're building a drone, why do you need $500,000? And then they're thinking, maybe his IQ isn't that high, and we got to build the drone to prototype the one. I said, no, I understand that. Why do you think you need to build the drone? Professor Blank, we're building I said, what? I said, in fact, on this one, I said, I think it's not too late for me to go back and change your grade. I said, what business are you in? And they explained again, the drone and the scanner. I said, no, you're not. What business are you in? Oh, we provide data to farmers. I said, so do the farmers care right now where the data came from? Whether it came from a camera on a stick that you were running around through the fields with, or that you put it on a helicopter, or you did something else, or did they care about the drone? Oh, we're engineers. We wanted to build the drone because it's going. I said, yeah, that's what I thought. I said, so let's do and so we talked them through it, and in about 10 minutes they got, oh, we wouldn't need more than $5,000 to dummy up some data, and then most of it was for travel, to show farmers what the data would look like if they could acquire it on this regular basis. And all of a sudden, that's the definition, by the way, of a minimum viable product. An MVP is not always a smaller version of a drone or a camera. It was just simply figuring out what business we were in, and the MVP was, would anybody care about this data and pay us a sufficient amount to have a business? By the way, they discovered something else when they finally focused on the data. As it turns out, in the United States, there are crop dusters who are now called aerial application something or other. Technicians. 5,000 airplanes fly over crops in the U.S. all the time. You might see them sometimes on the highway when you're driving up and down. They'd be happy, it turned out, to be a third party for hyperspectral cameras as they were flying over the field. So these guys, and they kept saying, we wanted to build the drones. I said, I can understand that, but why don't we focus on building a business? Does that?
Yeah, it's good. So let's move over to software.
Yes.
Right? Which is got some different characteristics. So we have a lot of students who think they want to build a business around a piece of software. Sometimes it's an app, sometimes it's more sophisticated. They think they can't get any IP protection on software, which is probably true at this point. How can they get started? And how can they discuss their idea without essentially giving it away to somebody who could go implement it?
So, you know, or any of you seen the Facebook movie with the Winklevoss brothers and blah, blah, blah. You know, at the end of the day, for things that aren't IP protected, it's going to be how quickly you learn and how quickly you execute. And it's the combination of learning and execution that's going to make you successful. And by that I mean, you know, for at least from where I sit, you could give away your first ideas because they're wrong. Not your technology, but your view about how to price it, how to market it, who the customers are. Just sitting in your dorm or your lab, I'll guarantee you you're wrong. What you're going to do is, if you actually follow a process and actually start talking to customers, build MVPs, figure out how to price it, figure out how to sell it, figure out what features to build, and more importantly, not what to build, you know, is some of the hardest things to do. And by the way, any computer science people in the room? Great. So startups are an NP complete problem, meaning they're computational and unsolvable. There's just way too many variables. So what this lean startup process does is provide a bounding box to make it like an NP hard problem, but not NP, meaning you can kind of solve and bound this problem by getting out of the building and learning. Now, one of the interesting ways to get out of the building is, you know, figuring out whether people would pay. So this is not only just asking people, do they like it? That's kind of customer discovery. It's customer validation is, would you pay to actually use or buy the product? And we teach students to, once they have what I call a happy meeting, oh, this is great, we love it, come back when it's done. No, you said you'd love it? I'd like $20 now. What? It's not done. That's okay, here's a number 10 envelope, we'll just put the $20 in here with your name, and I promise you I won't use the money, but you'll be the first on the list to get the product. You'd be surprised how those conversations change to the minute that somebody has to take out their wallet. And imagine if you were asking for 20,000 or 2 million, which I've done, is, well, you love it, this is our 6th meeting? Great, I want a conditional purchase order, completely cancelable if I can't deliver, but you owe me that money if I could deliver. All of a sudden the conversation gets much more serious and much more interesting, and you learn a ton by just doing that kind of validation.
Okay. So let's move to our bioengineering department. And you developed the I-Core curriculum and based on the Lean Startup. Really, when Eric Ries wrote his book, it was about software, and this has been expanded to other businesses. But how have you changed the model for life science startups?
Okay. Probably this time worth recapping a glossary of words.
Okay.
So Lean Startup is simply the combination of this business model canvas I talked about earlier, customer development, and agile engineering. The sum of the three called the Lean Startup. The Lean Launchpad, which you referenced, is simply the class I teach, and you teach here, which is how do we actually go do that rather than just read about it? And it's just anywhere from a 8 to 16-week class, depending on the school and the domain, and basically uses all those principles, but makes students get out and talk to 10 to 15 customers or partners a week. And in the course of the class, you speak to over 100 customers and partners. And by the way, if you're an engineer, it's the most frightening thing you're ever going to do. Because my line, and please don't take it as a pejorative, but the difference between an introvert and an extrovert for most of the people I teach is whether they're staring at their shoes or your shoes. And you're all supposed to laugh, not be insulted. But in 6 weeks, we teach you how to make eye contact, because the key idea is you haven't actually learned anything unless you watch people's pupils dilate. Truly, that's what we're teaching you, is not only how to ask the questions, but to watch the body language. Are there any salespeople in the room? I'll just close your ears if I'm going to tell you something. And so, listen, most of you, though some of you will, most of you will never be salespeople. but you have more excess compute capacity than they do. And you are all capable of emulating empathy in a way that that we will teach you how to do, right? And so we will teach you how to go into emulation mode in a way that over time, at first it will be awkward. Hi, how about them Chargers? You know? How is your name of spouse? I mean, your wife, you know, here. And after a while, you kind of get used to this thing. Not that we want you to be sales or marketing, but in fact, we want you to be efficient about gathering data. Other people have it here. Most engineers have it here, but it's a very teachable skill. Again, not trying to change your career, but I'm trying to teach you how to get data. All right, and so that's the Lean Launchpad class. When it was adopted by the National Science Foundation, that is, they take my class and simply now teach it for principal investigators, grad students, and teams of 3. It's called the I-Core, or Innovation Core. That's now been taught to close to 500 teams, and then each university that teaches it have also taught their own version of it, so probably over 1,000 teams have been through that. So Lean Startup is the kind of the process. Lean Launchpad is when it's taught in a university. I-Core, it's when it's taught in National Science Foundation. Now to your question is, so does the same process work for all these domains, and what happens when we hit life science? And the answer is, what happens at the 30,000-foot level is it's the same. That is, hypotheses framed by business model canvas, get out of the building with customer development, and build MVPs for minimum viable products. But the tactics are radically different. Radically meaning at the 500-foot level, unless you understand, for example, for a device, you know, the regulatory regime, what a 510K versus a PMA means, or if you don't understand CPT codes and reimbursement, or you don't understand freedom to operate and IP, and if you don't understand what clinical trials are, you know, going at the 30,000-foot level, you really don't need to know about product market fit and customers, because the other stuff is equally important. So we just emphasize different parts of the hypotheses that are very domain specific. And just to give you an example, you know, for those of you familiar with devices and therapeutics, even though they're, quote, life sciences, those business models are radically different. You know, things you worry about for a therapeutic are radically different than what you worry about a device, at least for commercialization, which is even more different for diagnostics, which is different from digital health. And so on the very tactical level, in almost every other field than life sciences, we worry about what we call the right side of the canvas. We worry about what's called product market fit, the fit between what you're building and the customer. It turns out in almost all the life sciences domains, the left side, reimbursement, regulation, IP, is equally important to product market fit. And I'll tell you the other favorite example is for people who've never been in devices, you ask, so who's the customer? And you kind of get answers, well, my grandma who's going to get a new hip. And then you kind of go, really, grandma going to put the hip in herself? Oh, I guess doctors. Okay, is doctor the customer? Can he pick any device? No, I guess there's someone like tells him which one. Well, where's he going to do the operation? Oh, the hospital. Does the hospital have any say that they're great? Can the hospital pick any device? Oh, there's some regulation. Okay, are they a customer at first? Yeah, okay. And by the way, is grandma paying for this on her credit card? No. Well, who's paying? Well, insurance. Well, is insurance a customer first or a reimburser? And how does that get paid? Wait a minute. Will they reimburse for any type of? Now all of a sudden you realize it's not just customers. We could actually rename that box and call it stakeholders and realize that grandma actually doesn't matter. It's a big idea. Now grandma is not the stakeholder at all that matters. Right? There are a lot of other stakeholders. What you thought is you were building a new device to make grandma's life easier. She's the least of your problems until you figure out the rest of the business model. Now, if you're an engineer who you thought you've developed a new technique for medical devices, this is both depressing and awe-inspiring when you realize how business works, because we will teach you this and you will be an expert by the end of the class. And by an expert, I mean you will be able to go and draw the diagram and talk about all the stakeholders and what you've learned and what's important, et cetera, and your life will be screwed forever because you will now know how to build a company.
Okay.
Okay.
Why don't we bring the house lights up
Yep.
and see if we have some questions from the audience?
Okay.
Uh,
Up, there we go. All right,
Okay.
you want to pick them?
Oh, sure, we'll start here.
So how do you get your teammates to buy in? So I've gone from startup to startup now. I've actually been doing it for like 7 or 8 years now. And the hardest thing for me has been to get others that don't subscribe currently to the philosophy to subscribe.
So, you know, this is something that you can't convince somebody. There's only two ways to do it. You could find a founding team where you're all aligned, or you could be the CEO and say, this is what we're going to do, my way or the highway. And I'm just telling you, I've spent a lot of time trying every other way of, you know, it's just an exercise in frustration. And the reason why, by the way, is if what you've been listening to, this is stupidly simple, right? There's no math involved in this process, but it is a massive mindset change from what a founding, like, passionate technologist wants to do. Don't get in my way. I'm building this stuff, you know, or we'll hire people. Okay, then those people need to do what everybody else was doing for 30 years. We now have evidence, real data, that says this is the most efficient way to minimize the amount of resources, time, money, people, finance, you know, to build an early stage venture. But there's no rule that says we have to do it, other than if you want now NSF funding and ultimately NIH funding. And this year, the DOE has announced they've adopted it, and they're calling it LabCorp, and the DOD is using it in places I can't tell you about. So enough people who should know better, who've been doing, you know, commercialization of science for a while, have finally concluded we have now found an efficient process. If you can't convince your co-founders or other people, you're in the wrong place, or follow their process.
You can hook me up with some Amazon codes so I can get them their book.
Yeah, happily do that.
Okay, I see some mics out here. If they're live, could we get you to sort of come up to the mic so that everybody can hear the questions?
Or we'll repeat them. Yeah. Okay.
All right, we'll try it that way then. We'll repeat the question if somebody.
So I've watched your videos about customer development, and my question was that it's not always true that if you're not building a product that's open to the entire public out there, it's hard to get in touch with the customer in the first place. Let's say you're building an enterprise solution, and then when you actually get in touch with them, they want to see something real, so they buy into it. I mean, that's what I heard from a lot of people. I've not tried this, but this seems to be a problem. Like, I'm not sure how to go about this particular scenario.
You want to summarize that?
How do you do it?
So your question was about a B2B sale,
Right.
right? And that customers, at least your friends, have reported that they want to see a product before they'll have a conversation with you?
Right. I mean,
Okay, so let me answer
any product where you
Yeah.
cannot have direct access to the customer. How
Right.
do you build
So that's not customer development. What you just described was sales. And there's a big distinction. Let me, in fact, articulate 3 different categories. There's customer development, there's sales, and there's a giant focus group, right? Customer development is not sales, nor is it a giant focus group. And in fact, let me answer the question you didn't answer first, which is the goal of getting out of the building is not to add up all the customer responses and then come up with a number and average them. The goal of customer development is to inform the founder's vision and actually provide some facts. Because sometimes the data is in the outliers, and I'll give you an example. One of my classes, students came up with an app, and they convinced themselves that it was an iPhone app, an Android app, and they were going out to figure out pricing. And because we track all their customer interviews, I know what was being said. And I said, they came up with a number presented in their weekly summary. I said, why don't you tell the class how you derived that this price was going to be $9.99? I said, well, Professor Plank, we spoke to 50 customers. They were so proud. 50 customers. Well, why don't you tell the class how you came out with $9.99? $9.99. Well, 47 of them said that was the right price. Great. Why don't you tell the class what the other 3 said? Oh, they were outliers. Did this just die? There we go. we discarded that data. Well, why don't you tell the class what they said? Oh, those 3 people were crazy. They said we should price this thing at $200,000. It's enterprise software. And so what did you do? Oh, we discarded that data. Now, all of you should be laughing, or I'll repeat the whole session here. Right? It's not a focus group, guys. The idea was you should have been chasing those 3 to see if those were the only 3 people in the world, or whether there was truly a signal in the noise. That's why you're getting out of the building. Now, to answer your specific question, somebody was trying to sell if the answer was come back when you have a product. If you remember what I said in step 1 is you need to validate whether your view of just the problem is shared by others. That's not talking about you at all. That's you getting out, trying to understand who has this problem and does it exist. Number 2 is, the next step is still not selling. It's how are they solving the problem today? That's customer discovery. And for time, I'll just point out that let's say it's a B2B sale and you want to sell something technical to the IT department. The first instinct for a great entrepreneur is I'm going to call him a CIO. That's the last person in the world should be your first call. Anybody know why? You're going to be wrong. You only get 1 call with that CIO. And I'll guarantee you that if that's the first call you're making, you're going to look like an idiot 6 months from now because you're going, why did we say that? What you really want to do is to call much lower in the organization until you actually understand what's their problem, how they solve it today, what other things are they using, etc. By the time you come into the CIO's office, you ought to be able to say, gee, some people, like companies like yours, have problems like this. And you want the CIO to go, why, yes, we do too. And some of them have been looking at these types of solutions. Why, yes, we've been evaluating that too. And like you're going through the checklist and they're thinking you're a genius rather than you looking, does this make sense? That's not sales, right? That's customer discovery and then ultimately validation.
I think to add to confusion, I think maybe a question for you is if you were
Get the
starting
mic over here.
MIPS over,
Yes,
if you were founding MIPS over,
right.
how would you go about doing that using the lean
Yeah,
methodology?
ask the question again.
The question I was asking, maybe interpreting what she was asking is, if you were to start MIPS over
Yes.
and founding MIPS as a new company,
Yeah.
how would you apply the lean startup methodology?
Right. So MIPS was a risk processor semiconductor company way back in the dark ages when you could physically see the bits. That's how big they were in the silicon. That's a joke for the semiconductor. The rest can explain it to you.
It's the same problem, right? You got a new architecture or something. Who do you talk to, and how do you get the answer?
I've asked that question to myself a couple of times, and it turns out now I'll get technical for a second and then pop up. It turns out that one of the questions that the architect, John Hennessy, actually asked me was, gee, should the byte order of this chip be big Indian or little Indian? And first of all, because I was the marketeer, I had to have him explain to me what the heck that meant. And then oh, I got it. Let me talk to a bunch of people. And of course, the answer was people wanted both. And because I was the marketeer, instead of processing that, I said to engineering, well, they want both. And of course, the hardware guys, Silicon, John Masuris and Hennessy said, well, that's only 1,000 gates. But the compiler guys said, do you understand what you're going to do for 30 years of what? And I said, no, not really, but it doesn't matter. Just give me the feature. I'm telling you now, and I'm not sure it would have been the right decision, but in hindsight is, I would have tried to understand the problem first and try to figure out what business were we in, what did it mean, etc. But that feature, anybody ever use the MIPS architecture at all? Anybody in the room? The reason why it has little Indian and big Indian is because I didn't understand the question. Now you're looking at the guy responsible for it. The rest of you just know I made a dumb decision. So the answer is, on that one, I was just trying to get feature lists without truly understanding. Here's a big idea. If you're in engineering doing customer discovery, the goal is to make the minimum feature set, not the maximum feature set. Any fool can make a maximum feature set and never deliver the product, by the way. Your goal is to figure out what's the minimum viable product, not just the viable product. At MIPS, while the architecture was minimum, the features were not. The features were as much as we could cram in the time we had. Does that answer your question a bit? Other question? Yes. Yes.
I'm one of those non-engineering co-founders here. So my question to you is, what's your best advice for people like us?
Make sure you have are you with an engineering-driven company?
Yeah.
Okay, what's your role?
Marketing, sales, and so on.
Great, and who's the CEO?
He's a CS major.
Great. Unless you have a commitment for him to spend, or her to spend at least 20% of their time out of the building in the first year, go quit your job or don't even think about doing anything lean, or else it's going to be you. And you're going to have to like justify yourself rather than, and let me give you a specific example. So at my last company, Epiphany, which was an enterprise software company in the dark ages, my co-founder was the VP of engineering, and we worked together long enough to kind of, Ben agreed that he would spend 20% of his time out of the building with me. But my job was to only call him in when stuff was really important. And so one of our first potential customers was Schwab, which was back then and still would have been an important first or third customer. And they kept asking us for an architectural feature I knew we didn't have in our metadata. I mean, it just wasn't there because no one quite understood it was important. In hindsight, it was stupidly simple. We should have known that what was called householding was a key feature for database marketing. Duh, we didn't know it, but they kept saying, Steve, there's no workaround for this. We need this, and your architecture just doesn't have it. And so Ben went up with me, and that was the agreement. He would go into accounts when I've realized I ran into an architectural roadblock, and Ben listened, asked a bunch of questions, and got back in the car. And we were in Mountain View, and Schwab was in San Francisco, and we get in the car, start driving, and Ben doesn't say a word. And because I've known Ben for 20 years, I knew this was the game we were going to play. We passed the airport. Ben doesn't say a word. We passed like Palo Alto. Ben doesn't say. Finally, I gave up. He said, "Okay, Ben, what are we going to do about like that householding feature?" He said, "Steve, just have Schwab read page 6 of the spec." I said, "Ben, our spec only has 5 pages." And he looked at me and said, "Not anymore." My point is unless you have that, sorry, that was a long shaggy dog story to say, you and the technical founder who can make those decisions on the spot need that agreement, or else you're not going to do lean. You'll try to do lean, and they're going to try to do whatever they want to do. That's just an impedance mismatch, much like that conversation that we had up here. Am I making sense? You need the founding team aligned that that's how we're going to work. Doesn't mean you need to ultimately drag them out on every meeting, but when you see something that you think, wait a minute, I'm not understanding this, or worse, I've now heard this 3 or 4 times and I truly don't understand it, I need like the technical founder in here who can not only hear it, it's not a technical problem, I need to change something dramatically. What Ben just said wasn't just another spec, it was another 9 months of work, right? Only he could make that decision, but he clearly understood the business as well as I did. You get Schwab, we'll roll over all the financial companies. You don't get Schwab, you won't understand what was missing in the architecture. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
Down here?
Yes.
Wait for the mic first. Look behind you.
Hello? So my question...
Can you sing? You can sing.
Can I? Okay, no, I'll save you guys from that. I'm feeling very nice today. I wouldn't do that to you guys. So my question is not totally related to this talk, but you may have had... You've seen...
42 is the answer, whatever the question is.
Okay. Thank you. So,
Next.
we've heard of like Airbnb like going on Craigslist, like writing a script that automatically takes listings and puts it on their website, and like other forms of guerrilla marketing done by like engineers, right?
Yep.
So what are some other like examples of marketing done by engineers that are cool that you have seen?
That's one of these quizzes. I don't know, marketing by engineers. I have to think about that for a second. I mean, but I've had, you took the one example of screen scraping, which you know, almost all my software startups do in my class is, why, of course, the cheapest possible hack to get the maximum, you know, at least demonstration that I got a viable business here. Which, by the way, gets you into a fine line between ethics and entrepreneurship. And you have to by the way, I will tell you that that is an important line. If you're going to be the founding CEO, you want to remember, is whatever you do as the CEO or the founding team will set the culture for the rest of the company. And what happens is when these companies scale and you no longer have direct control over those people, they will have taken their lead from the culture that you set. And when you find out someone was lying, cheating, and stealing and they get caught, they go, well, that was the company culture. So I'm not suggesting that's what you suggested, but I'm segueing into a different answer is I don't think screen scraping is a violation of X if all you're doing is prototyping something or proving you have a business. But you should be careful about the culture you consciously or unconsciously set on day one. And it gets worse is if you become a public company, what was, quote, legal or whatever as a private company, now you do those same activities and encourage them as a public company, you as a founder are actually going to jail. And so you need to keep those things in mind. But yes, you know, great engineers figure out how to do shortcuts all the time, and great shortcuts. I'll think of some more in a second.
Okay.
How about Silicon Valley versus San Diego? Meaning, how much the location matters,
Yeah, so this is a comment I was making for a bunch of people, and maybe it'll start here or somewhere else, is that every region needs its own regional playbook. Meaning, how many of you read Hacker News? Right, how many read, you know, TechMeet, you know, or TechCrunch? Anyway, okay, yeah, okay. The problem is that's written predominantly by people living in Silicon Valley. And so if you attempt to follow Silicon Valley rules in different regions, not only San Diego, you get some bizarre outcomes. Is that, you know, the ecosystems differ in every location. And remember the domain expertise. In New York is domain heavy in media and finance and real estate startups, and the Valley still does heavy tech and social media in San Francisco, and does life science as well. Here we do life science and other stuff. But the other part that, any angel or VCs in the room? Okay, so it turns out the financial ecosystem is the other half of what makes an ecosystem. Not only is it the entrepreneurs, but it's the financial ecosystem. You know, VCs in Silicon Valley won't even cross the bay, let alone, you know, though now maybe they'll fly down here for some, but it turns out that the financial ecosystem differs everywhere. And so my point is that every region needs their own playbook on how you build the startup in San Diego or in Omaha or what versus Mountain View in San Francisco. And that includes, you know, how do you get a seed round, where are the incubators and accelerators, who are the great VCs, you know, how do you engage with Silicon Valley? Do you keep R&D here? Do you move sales and marketing there? Do you get funded there? Does that make sense? And I think, you know, here, this school is a great center for actually collecting all that information and data. Mm-hmm. So did I answer your question?
Well, yes. Can I add something to that question? So how successful would be, like, how easier would be selling a local company in Silicon Valley versus the same company in San Diego?
How successful will selling?
How easier could it be
to sell?
To sell a company.
To sell a company?
Well, are you talking about a liquidity event or a funding event? To fund it or?
Just selling the company.
Well, it depends what your industry is in. I mean, you know, if you want to sell to Facebook, Google, and Twitter, then having some proximity may give you an edge, only because of, excuse the pun, FaceTime. You know, if you're in some other businesses, you know, Silicon Valley is the wrong place. Maybe your potential acquirer is GE, you know, being in because you're a medical device, or Medtronic or J&J being in Silicon Valley gives you no edge at all.
There were a number of companies at a session earlier today at the investors conference who are large company acquirers.
Right.
And that question came up, and every one of them said, location doesn't matter.
Right.
They'll buy companies anywhere in the
So
world.
let me tell you what does matter, and I'm going to give you a dirty secret, both as a, not a dirty secret, but an interesting secret as both an entrepreneur and as an investor for any investors in the room. So the people who acquire companies are not some amorphous, nameless people. They're, in fact, only 5 people on average in every major corporation responsible for M&A or biz dev or acquisition, whatever they call it. You need to start an Excel spreadsheet. It's not even big enough to have a database. An Excel spreadsheet of who do I think might be potential acquirers, what are their names, and how many meetings have I had with them by accidentally running into them at conferences or presenting to them or at coffee shops or wherever. This is not some theory. If you decide that an exit for you is some acquisition, then don't just stand there praying for a date, right? You go to bars if you want to, I mean, whatever it is, you need to be where the action is, and you need to target it as a strategy, not as some accidental tactic. Does that? So I'm trying to be, and when I say this, it seems to be some light bulb to be, really, they're like people I need to target. It's just like going after a customer, except you can't let them know you're chasing you're chasing them. And it has to look kind of like, oh, what a coincidence. This is the 4th time we keep running into each other in the sauna at the gym, naked. Gee, I didn't even think you live in this city. Oh, I visit a lot, you know. Let me tell you, you pull that one off, you're going to get a deal. Does that make sense? I mean, so if you want to get acquired, and by the way, I used to, in fact, think it was pejorative to flip a company, but not in this economy. In this economy, and what's happened to the IPO market is, you know, M&A is viable as a public offer.
And as a sort of follow-on to that, or actually a prequel to that, if you're trying to sell this company and you've raised money for it already, in doing your investment rounds, you have your first draft of that spreadsheet that says who you're going to be acquired by and how and when and under what conditions.
Right.
So you already know that if you have successfully raised money. Over here. We'll come back to you if we. All right, just speak loudly.
Could you share some insights or suggestions, heads up, for the people who want to start startups in the big data area?
In the which area?
The big data, like data science.
Okay.
Big data,
what,
data science.
What insight would you like?
Any insight?
So what kind of any insight would you like?
Trying to get past the generic insights that you've already shared.
Yes, but what is it about? I mean, big data, so to be fair, you've just described the technology, not a business. So help me understand what business you want to be in. Big data is technology. I got a lot of data. Great. Everybody has a lot of data. What do you want to do with it?
Like the business would be like analyzing data for the customer.
Great. What do you want to do? Uplift, churn reduction? What do you have in mind? And
like
if you don't have that in mind, that's in fact why you need to get out of the building. So no. I don't mean that to be insulting, but are you a scientist?
Yes.
Okay, good. Because you asked a scientist question, and I mean that nicely. Is big data is a technology. You might have some algorithms, some insight or whatever. Now you need to go out and you have a solution looking for a problem. Truly. That's how most science starts. I invented X. Oops, you know, who the heck actually cares about X? And in your case, if you have some neat ways to solve some big data problems, now you need to go out and just basically search a space. You're looking for a bounding box. Is this, you know, would Procter & Gamble like this? Or is it someone else? And who's collecting this data? Am I answering the question you're asking? Or?
Yes, then do you have suggestions for how to look for those areas?
Yes, that you need to take one of these classes that are offered here, right? Why don't you suggest what class?
Right. Well, we have a number of classes for credit or not for credit, but basically teaching this methodology about going out and talking to customers.
And truly,
and
within weeks, you could be an expert in understanding this space. Weeks. It will be uncomfortable. But
Actually, I was in one of those classes.
and you're still asking the question, what was your grade? Because
Because
I'm
I
going to go
changed my
back and change
science.
it. Great, next question. Let's move right on. All right.
Well, let's get somebody who hasn't asked up there. Up there.
This is fun.
Hi. So you talked a lot about a lot of companies in your past that you worked with students and stuff who succeeded, but can you tell us a little bit about the failures, the ones who failed?
Well,
if there's anything you can share about that, like some
well,
bad-
what do you want to know? No, don't. What do you want to know about the failure? How's it
so
feel?
what are
What's
some
it-
major pitfalls that you notice that is very
Sure.
consistent or something
So
that
let
we
me-
definitely look out for?
Let me talk about my failures, which so I could, and hold on to the mic. Hold on to the mic.
You're on,
'cause-
okay.
No, you can sit down, but I want to make sure I answer your question because it's a great question. Because most startups fail. It's a big idea. Most startups fail. All you hear are the wonderful stories about the $1 billion and whatever, and what. Most startups are miserable experiences for founders. You get fired, or you have to lay off people, then they fire you, or worse, they fire you and then the company's successful, but they cram down the company, which means they diluted your stock, so you only own like $5.25 worth. I mean, there are all kinds of horrible failure modes. For me, the biggest failure, I've had 2 companies who left craters so deep they have their own iridium layer. For those of you not in geology, that means very big hole. And the last one was my next to last company. I realized I had raised $35 million for a company that I was on the cover of Wired magazine for, and 90 days later I realized I'm going out of business. Boy, was that kind of hard to explain, right? And I remember calling my mother, who was a Russian immigrant, and English still after 50 years wasn't her first language or even third. And so therefore everything I said in English, she'd pause and mentally, literally have to look up in some mental dictionary word by word, so there was a pause in the translation. And the conversation went like after the first 5 minutes of why don't you call, it was like, Mom, I'm just calling you to tell you I lost $35 million. Pause, translate. And then she logically said, where'd you put it? I said, no. Mom, I spent it, it's gone. Pause, translate. Then all of a sudden there was like Russian and Polish and Yiddish and whatever. She went, there's nowhere else for us to go. The country we came from is gone. and then she said, and we can't even change our name, it's blank. She was smart. She was pretty smart. I said, no, Mom, the reason why I'm calling you is that people gave me the money, and I had waited a while to call her. It just gave me another $12 million to do my next startup. And there was silence, and then she remembered English again, and she said, gee, they told us that only in America the streets are paved with gold. I never thought I'd live long enough to hear that it was. And I remind, by the way, both mostly foreign students who come to the U.S., I remind them that we have a special word for a failed entrepreneur, at least in Silicon Valley and in entrepreneurial clusters like San Diego. Do you know what that special word is in English for failed entrepreneur? Experienced. It's a big idea. So now I'm going to answer your question, though. That was like my failure mode. Biggest failure for me was hubris. Hubris means, and again, excuse me for being crude, I believe my own bullshit. I mean, I was capable of creating a reality distortion field so powerful, not only did I suck in investors, I sucked myself into it. So here I am. Look, I'm famous. It says so right here. But I lost sight of who my customers were. And that happened to be a secondary effect. It was the first company in my entire career where very quickly I realized I hated my customers. Turns out most of my career I was building pretty advanced technologies, selling to scientists, engineers, PhD students, etc. Here, for some reason, I got into the video game business, and my customers were 14-year-old boys who wanted to kill something. Seriously, the company was called Rocket Science Games. And I realized I couldn't stand them, and therefore I stopped talking to them and listening to them. And that was, in fact, combined with hubris, just shutting off any customer input and not wanting to hear it, is probably a typical failure mode. And I kind of went through all that. And then the third part of this, which was another piece of what we teach don't do for customer development, is I had a co-founder, and it's not his fault, it was mine because I was CEO, who believed he completely understood the customer problem and completely understood what to build to satisfy their needs. Turns out he was probably as wrong as anybody in the entire history of the gaming business. But it didn't matter because I was capable of raising more and more money until it finally all caught up with us. So, that was the only time in my entire 21 years of being an entrepreneur that there were 3 weeks where I hated to go to work. And that's in 21 years. I couldn't wait to go to work in Silicon Valley for 20 years, 11 months and 1 week. In fact, there were days that I would drive down Highway 101, main highway in Silicon Valley, wondering if this was the day they were going to make me to pay to work there. And I was always calculating how much could I afford to pay them, because I used to love my job so much. And literally, it was a miserable time for a little while until I went through the 12 stage of grief for a failed entrepreneur. Step 1 is you blame everybody else. Actually, step 1 is you get depressed. And then step 2 is you blame everybody else. And then step 3, you kind of go through the stages of grieving. And then finally, for this experience, I actually took ownership of what went wrong, and the lean startup process actually started getting built in my final company, which was called Epiphany, for lots of reasons. And we used everything I had screwed up and actually ran the first lean startup until Eric Ries actually did it at, when I was on his board at IMVU. Did I answer your question a bit?
Yes, you
Yeah.
did. Thank you.
Okay. Have time for a couple more questions?
Who has the best questions?
I do, hopefully.
Okay.
For those of us who are graduating, what would you recommend? Maybe get some work experience first, or jump into entrepreneurship straight away?
So, I'm impressed with any of my students or you guys who are 20-something years old who think you could start a company. And not that you can't, but my career was 15 years of apprenticeship, from the lowest possible whatever to finally running a company. The good news is now you guys have more data and information about what it takes to be an entrepreneur than existed in one place ever. I mean, think about it. In the 20th century, information on how to build companies and start companies was limited by your coffee bandwidth. Truly. Information was transferred over coffee. That was it. There was no internet. There were no books. You literally would have coffee with other entrepreneurs, and it was how many coffees could you drink in a day, and that was the limitation.
And before Starbucks, where could you go?
That's right. So, and this is no joke. Now your biggest problem is, what classes do I take, and how many websites do I read, and how do I process all this contradictory information? Congratulations. But to answer your question, you've already answered it. If you're not driven by, I got to get this idea built, then don't start something because you think it's what people need to do. Go work in some other startups. Figure out where your passion is, and whether you want to be an employee or a founder. A founder is, I'm going to say it again, it's not a job. It's got to be something you can't get out of your head. It has to be something you're waking up in the middle of the night and talking incessantly to your friends are sick of you saying this stuff. And then that you got to just go do this. In fact, that was always my shtick, is when I would do something new, I'd be the one acting surprised, and my friends would be saying, "That's all you've been talking about for the last night." And I go, "Really?" They go, "You were the most boring person, because that's all," and you not even realize that. If that's not happening to you, it's okay. It will eventually happen to you. No, there isn't. No, there isn't a debate. No, I'm just saying you haven't heard me yet. There's no debate. So when you're ready to be a founder, you will take your clothes off and throw it over a barbed wire fence, and then say, the only way to get to the other side, because I'm stupid there is to get over that darn fence. There is no debate. If there's a debate, you've decided, and I'm just telling you, it's okay. The nice part is, at least in the US today, it's very hard to starve to death. You got to work hard at it. No, you got to work hard, truly. You got to work hard, particularly a graduate of this school. You really got to work hard. I mean, I'm not talking about sicknesses and emotional issues, but literally, if you're healthy, it's hard. Plus, there's a big enough safety net. Starving to death is not an option. So therefore, that's the minimum on the downside, right? The upside is, what are you ready to go commit to? And my point is, and if you're ready to commit, failing at it, that's okay. You know, as I said, failure here is just experience. But it doesn't mean you have to do this when you graduate. As I said, it took me 15 years or 12 years or whatever it was. For the first part of my career, I just learned from other people. And I actually think, well, nowadays probably wouldn't have taken me 8 startups. It for sure would have taken me 4, just the way I learned and what I did. Okay, next question.
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
What do you think of this phrase, fail fast?
So I don't think fail fast really encapsulates the whole process. You know, what we're doing is actually learning fast. You know, no one likes to fail. We got to embrace failure as part of the learning process, but it's really learn as fast as you can is probably the way I would phrase it. It happens to be you learn because you fail, but not because you want to fail. Does that? Okay.
I imagine you've worked with a lot of different founders and partners. Is there something other than commitment to the lean startup principles and passion and motivation that you look for in partners? Or
yeah, it's a great question. So the question, can everybody hear that or no? So the question was, what do you look for in co-founders and partners? Is it lean or something else? You know, the good news or bad news is, you know, doing a startup with a team, a founding team, is worse than getting married with someone. You're going to be spending more time in your company than you are in a relationship. And hopefully it's a platonic relationship, but well, that screws up a startup every time. But truly, if you haven't gotten some practice, meaning minimum done a startup weekend or some kind of entrepreneurial activity under high stress with that team, you are making a major mistake. This is a major commitment, and you know, if you could get any activity that you and your team has kind of been through together without actually committing to a company, that would be step 1. Step 2 is that, you know, there's kind of a set of heuristics about what a founding team should have, and less so the lean religion, and I don't care whether you have that or not, but the founders need to be aligned on a couple things. How long are you going to work, you know, 7 days a week, 5 days a week? What's the work ethic in the company? What's the culture in the company? How resilient are you and your co-founders? So, you know, we talked about speed, but resilience is what happens when stuff fails. If you buckle and you go home and you can't get out of a funk for 3 months, you might be in the wrong job, or your co-founder might be in the wrong job. How curious is, you know, are the founders? Curiosity turns out to be one of the unheralded things, and we talk about agility, we talk about tenacity, but we don't talk about curiosity. It turns out that being able to identify patterns out of noise, right? You're doing pattern recognition requires maybe, I've seen this pattern in physics and it's the same in biology, or I've watched this somewhere in devices and gee, that might be applicable to big data. And if you are just incredibly narrow, sometimes that limits your ability to see patterns. Am I answering any of your questions? Yeah. So one is you want to stress test the team, if possible, before you actually commit. 2 is you want to understand, you know, does the skill set of the team kind of, if there's no one who likes talking to customers, you know, you guys are going to default to, oh, we'll hire someone to do this. Bad idea, in my opinion. And then 3 is you need to be all committed in the same way.
You're familiar with Noam Wasserman's
Yes.
work, right, Luke? Wrote a book, professor at Harvard.
Yep.
And his bottom line on this question is the best chance for success for a founding team is a group of people who've worked together before.
Okay. I did,
which is exactly what Steve
right,
said.
I did 3 startups with the same team. All 3 of them were IPOs.
Okay, we got the last question over here.
Do you have any insights on managing your psychology while in a startup?
So the question was, do I have any insights in managing your psychology? You know, I used this phrase earlier, and I happen to be a big believer in it. Steve Jobs coined the term, or someone coined it about him, was reality distortion field. Anybody ever hear that before? What it really means is one of the founders needs the ability to kind of spin a vision that kind of entrances customers, potential investors, potential hires, and the founding team itself into understanding why you're putting in these hours and these years to create something that didn't exist before. If you don't buy in to the mission, to that vision, that when stuff gets tough, you're going to be going, well, you know, why am I doing this? And so number one is, the phrase I always use is, your eye needs to be on the prize, not the obstacles, because the obstacles are always going to be in front of you. But the prize is the thing that's 2 to 3 years away. And you and everybody else needs to be continually focused, even though you might be learning that the prize might be over here or over here. The goal is eyes on the prize, and the obstacles are just things you remove in between you and the prize. And sometimes they're miserable, and sometimes your path doesn't go as straight as you wanted, but that's still the goal. And that's how I at least kept myself going, is remembering, you know, there's a line that says, when you're up to your ass in alligators, you forget the goal was to drain the swamp, right? That's the equivalent, is when all this stuff is coming at you, the prize had to be big enough and important enough to make you get up in the morning and still encourage a team of people to keep moving. Does that answer your question? And that's what entrepreneurship is about. We're all going to create something amazing that the world hasn't seen. And hopefully it's going to be a major contribution to, you know, life sciences or technology or social media or hardware or big data in a way that's going to be substantive. And the nice part is, if you do it because you want to create something, what's great about entrepreneurship in the United States and now worldwide is there could be a financial prize at the end. As I said earlier, you don't want to do it for the prize. You want to do it for the journey. And the prize at the end sometimes is just a wonderful thing that happens.
Okay, with that, I think we'll close the formal presentation. You'll stick around for a few minutes. So let's thank Steve for coming out to UCSD. And thank you all for coming out.